Wow. Hello, everyone. Can you hear us? Yep. All right. Wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us here. I think we're going to have a great 90-minute session, and want to make sure everybody's settled. Louder. Okay. All right. Yeah, I have one of these like soft voices too. So how about now? Yeah, you got it. Let me know if I'm not speaking loud enough. Just point at me. Okay. Good. All right. Well, welcome. This is the session called "The Impact of Violent Extremism on Women and Girls." Again, my name is Kathleen Kuehnast, and I direct the Gender Policy and Strategy team here at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And just to kind of warm us up a little bit, I'm from Minnesota. Do we have anybody from Minnesota? All right, yay! I'm going to ask our panelists to kind of have a state identification as well, so you get to know us a little bit. I did my PhD at the University of Minnesota, so I have a very fond feeling for the Gophers there. So, you know, this is a topic that is one that we really need some time with. There's a lot of good news and there's a lot of bad news. And I just wanted to begin for a second, and maybe we'll do it with a show of hands. How many of you decided to come to this because you know nothing? And don't be afraid. I mean, I'm just trying to understand where we are. Okay. How many came to it because of some story that has really affected you, some story about violent extremism? Yeah. And how many of you know somebody who's been directly affected by violent extremism? Wow. Okay. We're going to have a really good conversation. We're going to try to kind of lay out the basics and then look at the full spectrum of issues surrounding this area of violent extremism. And I want you to know we have a fabulous panel to help us do that. So without any further delay, I want to introduce each of them to you, and then I'm going to ask them to tell you a little bit about themselves. And I'll first just tell you who they are real quickly. I still can't hear. I'm pretty close. Hi, I'm really close. How is that? Like, oh my goodness. Yeah, all right. I am going to really work on my volume here. How is that? Better? Okay, thank you. And thank you for telling me, because I don't want you missing anything. All right. Danielle, I don't know, might need to go up a little bit on the mic. Thanks so much. So, to my right is Ms. Sanam Anderlini. She's the Executive Director of International Civil Action Network, otherwise known as ICANN. Sanam is one of the civil society organizers that led to UN Security Council 1325. How many people have heard of 1325? Okay, we'll bring that into the storyboard too. Sanam has been doing this for several decades and has worked all over the world, and I'm going to let her explain that information in 1 minute. I want you to also meet Miss Palwasha Kakar, who's my colleague here. Thank you so much for the volume. She is the Senior Program Officer in Religion and Inclusive Societies, a group here that focuses on all religions and their potential for building peace, as well as we know some of the ways that conflict occurs around religions. She formerly worked with the Asia Foundation, and she is Afghan American, and so has many perspectives to bring to the work here. Oge Onubogu, on my far right, is the Senior Program Officer in the Africa team, You met her boss a few minutes ago, Mike Yaffe. She has been doing this work for quite a while with NDI and NED, that's National Endowment of Democracy, and the National Democratic Institute. And she has worked nearly everywhere, it seems, in Africa, from Zimbabwe, Botswana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, and Cameroon. And so she will bring a lot of perspective on what's been going on in Africa, on the continent, and violent extremism. So without further delay, I'm going to ask Sanam to just tell us a tiny bit about yourself. So we're not just hearing all about violent extremism, but how did you get here? Not just today.
Just good morning. Lovely to see you all, your faces. It's lovely to be here. I'm Iranian. I was born in Iran. I went to an American school in Iran. And at the age of 11, the Iranian Revolution kind of came into our lives. And my father was a director in the National Oil Company. He was dealing with all of these workers that were going on strike. Our school was in the middle of the city, so we was in the center of where all the demonstrations were. So at around Christmas time, my parents decided that maybe it would be nice to send my sister and I off for a 10-day vacation with my aunt and uncle to France while to wait for things to calm down. We left with a suitcase of ski clothes and a lot of homework because they'd given us a lot of homework over Christmas. And I didn't go back for 7 years. We got stuck. We had to leave, go to England, and essentially that was the sort of start of an entirely new life. And I was just telling Kathleen that we landed in London, and the first thing that my aunts did for us was to find a school because they didn't want us to miss a day of school. We arrived. It was an American school there, and the teacher said to me in the 6th grade, "So how long did you live in Kansas?" So I've never been to Kansas. I know about Dorothy, but I've never been to Kansas.
Anyone here from
Kansas? Yeah. So I'd love to go to Kansas. And it was because our teachers had come from the Midwest, and so we had picked up a Midwestern accent in Tehran. And my 3rd grade teacher was from Minneapolis. So a few years ago, I was in Minneapolis, and I had to explain to people that Minneapolis, for me, aged 8 in the 3rd grade, was this like unbelievably kind of dreamy place that you go for the summer, because we asked her one summer, "Where are you going?" And she said Minneapolis, and she asked us, "Where are you going?" And we said, "We're going to the Caspian," which is, so all these names in the US were just like these kind of these places that we dream, we thought about, but we didn't really understand what they were, and we just saw it through the lens of our school and through Sesame Street and things like that. Yeah.
Wonderful beginning. Palwasha, tell us about yourself.
All right. So it's wonderful to be here and wonderful to see so many faces here that are interested in this topic. As Kathleen mentioned, I work on religion and inclusive societies. And a lot of times I'm asked, how did I reach this point of working with religious leaders on topics ranging from peace building to women's rights issues? And I like to give them this aha moment that I had as an 11-year-old that relates to my background. In 1989, I was growing up in Seattle. Anybody from Seattle or Washington State? Woohoo! Great. I was born there. I was raised by 2 parents, my father, who hailed from northern Afghanistan, from Faryab, and my mother, who was from Iowa. Iowan, wonderful. And in 1989, the Soviets were pulling out of Afghanistan. I, too, was 11 years old when this transition happened. It's really interesting, Sanam, to hear you. And my parents decided that it was time that they wanted to go to Afghanistan and contribute. They were both in the health field, and they wanted to give back. And we were always raised with this understanding that we would somehow go back and work in that area in Afghanistan. So we were very excited in 1989 to move to Afghanistan. But unfortunately, because of the civil war, we were only able to go as far as Peshawar, Pakistan, on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And there I got to meet my uncles and aunts who were living in refugee camps and their children, my cousins. And I quickly realized that I was the only girl cousin going to school. And my girl cousins wanted to go to school, but they weren't allowed to go to school. Part of it was that in northern Faryab there were not girls' schools. Girls went to the mosque to learn basic Arabic and how to pray and how to read the Quran, but that was it. And they wanted to go to school, but their parents wouldn't allow them, particularly their fathers. So I, being the young, cheeky American I was, went up to them, to my uncles, and said, "You gotta let your daughters go to school. This is wrong. They need to grow up to be doctors and teachers and contribute to the economy and contribute to society and contribute to their families." They weren't having any of that. They said, "No, in our culture it's not good. You know, women going to school, it's looked down upon. They become dishonorable. They're seen as in a bad light, and basically that the family honor is disrupted by that." And so I tried to continue on this issue, and it wasn't until I started talking about their right in Islam, that from a religious perspective, that they had the right to education. And I talked about the stories of the Prophet Muhammad and how he really emphasized the importance of education for boys and girls. And there's a hadith that says, even if it means going all the way to China, you should try and seek knowledge. And so I started to notice there was an opening there. And they were starting to absorb the message a little bit more and seeming to warm up to the idea. And with the help of my parents, really pushed on this issue, and I was able to get my girl cousins to go to school in the refugee camps. And I'm happy to say that now there are doctors and there are teachers who are my girl cousins. So that really was an aha moment for me, because I saw how religion could really be empowering and could open doors for women. And it really opened a lot of doors for me to try and think about what the role religion, and particularly Islam, has for empowering women. And when I went off to college, I went to college where my grandmother had gone in Kansas, Bethel College. Anybody from Kansas here? Woohoo! Oh, awesome! That's great. Yeah, so I went to Bethel College, which was also my grandmother's alma mater. And there I studied a lot about religion, and ended up going to Harvard Divinity School, really to look at the potential that women in early Islam had for creating spaces and women's empowerment today. But 9/11 happened during that time. And we heard our president talking about saving the Afghan women and how important it was after 9/11 to go and attack in Afghanistan and protect women there. And I thought, if we really want to work on women's empowerment issues in Afghanistan, we really need to work on religious issues and dealing with some of the religious sensitivities around women's rights. And so I switched my focus to looking at the intersection of gender, religion, and politics, and ended up going to Afghanistan right after my master's degree and working there for 10 years on various projects, but probably the one that I'm most passionate about is working with religious leaders in local communities to work on protecting women's rights from an Islamic perspective. So I'll end there and hand it over to Oge.
Thank you, Palwasha. Oge.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's wonderful to see this group of women in this building today. As I walked into the office this morning, I heard it's really nice to be with all of you here today. Listening to Sanam and Palwasha, I want to think or say that I have my own aha moment. I don't think I do, sorry. I think I was actually born into it. So, I was born in Chicago, Illinois. Are there folks from Chicago here? Okay. Very good. So I was born in Chicago, and my family moved to Nigeria when I was less than 2 years old. And we moved to Nigeria because my parents always had this thing about wanting to rebuild the continent. So from a very early age, they kind of picked up all their kids and moved all of us to Nigeria. And when we got to Nigeria, we lived in the middle belt of the country. For those of you who are familiar with Nigeria, is there anyone from Nigeria here? So for the familiar with Nigeria, in the middle belt of Nigeria, this is where the Christian south meets the Muslim north. And so both of my parents, even though they were academics, were also missionaries. And so a lot of the work that they did, I grew up a lot of my childhood in Nigeria was really working in a church family, in the church community. And there were a lot of things that we did for members of the community. And, you know, unlike women in Nigeria are actually extremely outspoken. So, so I've always been surrounded by very, very strong women in my life. So, and I think for me, sort of a turning point in Nigeria was in the early 2000s, when there was a lot of conflict that broke out in Plateau State. And my family, when we lived in Nigeria, we lived in Plateau State. Even though my family wasn't from the northern part of Nigeria, my parents thought it was important for the children, for us to experience a different part of the country and learn about different cultures, learn to speak a different language, learn about how others live. And so when this conflict broke out in early 2000, it was really sad to see how people had used religion as a tool, and how individuals had manipulated religion, and how many individuals had to suffer for that. So my family left Nigeria in the early 2000s, and we moved back to Texas. Is there anyone from Texas? We moved to Fort Worth, Texas, and because exactly why. Well, we moved because my parents couldn't stand the cold and they wanted to go somewhere else. So we moved to Fort Worth, Texas. And I lived in Fort Worth, Texas for a while, finished up high school, and then moved to Oklahoma to go to undergrad. So University of Oklahoma in the house, go Sooners. So went to the University of Oklahoma and finished my degree in international relations and international studies. And I knew from a very early age, with the upbringing that I had, that I wanted to do something international. I didn't want to be confined in a space. I wanted to go out, engage, interact, learn from others, make mistakes, and find new solutions to problems. And when I finished from undergrad, one of my first jobs right after college was with the International Rescue Committee, the IRC. And the IRC in Dallas, Texas had taken up a new role in resettling refugees from South Sudan and from Sierra Leone in Dallas. And seeing all these, many of them were women who were coming with kids from Sierra Leone and from South Sudan, because a lot of their husbands were fighting basically in the civil war, and many of them had lost their husbands as well. So you had all these women coming with their children to Dallas, Fort Worth. And this was a brand new experience for many of them, because many of them were coming straight from the refugee camps. They put them on a plane, and you land in the heat of Dallas. So it was a process trying to get them settled in the different communities, trying to get the children in school. And I did that for a little over a year. And at that point, I knew that I wanted to build a career out of this. I wanted to continue, because for me, my background is really in governance. And I've realized that a lot of a breakdown in systems, unresponsive governments, basically result in conflict and result in war. And I basically told myself that looking at all these women and all these children coming in to start life afresh, many of them were doctors from their countries, many of them were lawyers. These were educated women and children who had to be pulled out of school just because a conflict had broken out in their different countries. And so after doing that for a while, I left and I went to grad school. I went to Brandeis University in Massachusetts and was in the international development program, and I got a chance to engage and interact with so many people from different backgrounds. I've always thrived in a space where there is diversity, knowing that there are others out there that you could learn from. And immediately after grad school, I got a position working with the National Democratic Institute that eventually sent me back to Nigeria, back to the same neighborhood where I started from. And the first thing I did when I landed in Nigeria was to call my dad, and I said, I think you've been having a secret conversation behind my back with these folks, because it went full circle for me, from moving to Nigeria when I was less than 2 years old, and then starting my career after grad school in the same place where my parents had taken me to. So that is my story.
Thank you so much, Olga. Wow. Well, that just sets the scene, doesn't it? Amazing, amazing stories. And now I'm going to ask them to focus in on what this issue of violent extremism looks like, feels like, and to add some texture to the stories. They each have stories, and maybe that's where we begin. So in an attempt to define it, to explain why it matters to have a gender lens and a story. So
thank you. So for me, I come to violent extremism, but from 20 years of work on violence and crisis and so forth. And again, it goes back to my own experience that I was interested in how you prevent the outbreak of violence and crisis, which splits up your country, and how you prevent that happening to other people, for other people. Because what I realized was that an event that maybe in the news was 1979 for the US, in my life has continued to have impact. So when I was in my 20s, and I wanted to get married, half of my family couldn't show up for the wedding because they had visa issues. And then when I was in my 30s and I was having my children, the whole question of my father's in Iran and we're moving to the US and so forth. And then in my 40s, it was, again, this question of we're split apart. And now in my 50s, I just turned 50, and we're dealing with the question of what it means to have elderly relatives. And we're all over the place. And to think that you cannot return and visit someone before they die because you might get arrested, or because you're afraid, or because you might be detained, or just visa issues, just simple visa issues that we're now facing. So this one incident continues to affect our lives, and right now we're talking about potential war on Iran, which again, just is just so horrific to think about. So that was really the sort of the motivation of how do you resolve conflicts without resorting to violence. I started working. I was interested in media work. I worked at the BBC and CNN as an intern for a while, and realized that they covered the news, but they weren't acting. And I wanted to be involved in the actual change. And I found an ad in a newspaper to work for an organization called International Alert that was involved in conflict prevention and conflict transformation. This is early 1990s, and I was like, that's it, that's what I want to do. And I started working there, and the first day in my office mate was a woman from Rwanda, and this is 1996, 2 years after the genocide in Rwanda, where 800,000 people were killed in 3 months. And she told me her story. And it was a very humbling moment for me, because here I was understanding my own context, and then I was all of a sudden faced with people who had lived with the reality of unbelievable violence in their own lives. And through my work, we had colleagues who worked in Sri Lanka and Burundi and so forth, and that reality of, on the one, and this kind of dichotomy of, on the one hand, going to work every morning and hearing about 50,000 people being killed in Burundi, and having colleagues that are working on the issues to prevent it, and in the evenings going home out and out with your friends where they're working in Wall Street, or they're working in Morgan Stanley or whatever. I mean, it was just such a weird experience as a 25-year-old. But we started working. I had colleagues who were working on the question of women, and we had a meeting in 1998. I think it was the first one that actually happened globally, where we had women from 50 different countries around the world coming to talk about the experiences of conflict and their role in it. And what struck me was that we spend a lot of time talking about the impact. Well, if we talk about war and women, it's images of women being victims and being passive victims. It's the image of a refugee camp and a woman holding a baby and mosquitoes flying over their heads. What we don't see is that actually even that woman who is in a refugee camp and is looking after the baby, is having to figure out how to get food on the, you know, and how to get a blanket. And for me, every time, you know, we talk about these things, I say, I don't know how I would survive one night, let alone 3 months and 6 months and 17 years in that case. But these are not women who don't make choices. They have agency. And at the conference that we had, the agency for peace activism and stopping wars and stopping militarism became very, very prevalent. There was a group called the Four Mothers from Israel. They had sons in the army. They were sick and tired of Israeli soldiers dying in Lebanon. So they had posters standing on street corners in Israel saying, "Pull our sons, why are we in Israel, in Lebanon?" And because they were mothers of soldiers, the army couldn't ignore them. And so they became the movement that ended the occupation, Israeli occupation of Lebanon. They had a lot of men working with them, but the image of women, and especially women as mothers doing it, was a very strategic decision that they made. And there were women from Palestine and from Guatemala and from all over the place. And together we decided that this side of war, this side of conflict, is just absent from the policy and discourse internationally. So we devised a campaign called Women Building Peace from the Village Council to the Negotiating Table. And we had a public pillar of getting people to send postcards to Kofi Annan, and we had a partnership thing of going around conflict areas and finding women's organizations that were doing peace work and getting them to tell us what their issues were. And we had a policy pillar, which was to say we need to come up with a parameter and some vocabulary around how we understand the role of women in these contexts. And that led us to the work at the Security Council, which was basically, we identified the UN Security Council as one of our targets. And I had a really scary boss, and she sent me to New York, and I was so petrified of failing her that the idea of the Security Council was nothing compared to her. Like, I've got to get a Security Council. But it was a strategy of collaboration, of bringing organizations together, of drafting our own version of the Security Council resolution with consultation from around the world and getting input, of negotiating amongst ourselves, because we had organizations that were about nuclear disarmament, and we had the refugee, Women's Refugee Commission, and as women having to be strategic and tactical about what is it that we want and how to get that. So we ended up, it's a long story of how we got into the council and finally got the resolution, but it became for me the pivot around recognizing that in any conflict context you look at, whenever there's crisis or violence, women emerge as actors, and it's not all women, it's very, very hard work, but there are always women who emerge as peace actors. And women who, to this day, I don't know how they find it in themselves, but who take the pain of what's happened to them and transform it to be something positive. I have a colleague from Sri Lanka whose son went missing in 1998 in the Sri Lankan War. She took a group of mothers into the jungle without weapons, to talk to the LTTE, which were the scariest, one of the scariest organizations, militant organizations. Right now, I have colleagues who talk to Boko Haram, talk to the Taliban, are negotiating in these spaces, and they're really, really clever about how they use their identity as women, how they use their knowledge of religion and the local culture and the context, and their humanity. And this is one of the things that's really important. It's about reaching people through their humanity. And when it comes to violent extremism, it's really an evolution of the kind of problems we were dealing with in the 1990s. These are just iterations upon iterations. But what's different about this particular form of violence and this transnationalism that we see, I think, are two things. One is that they're not mobilizing on the basis of some grand, sort of theory of bringing us all together and, let's bring the poor of the world together like leftist movements of the past. That it doesn't matter, what color and race and gender you are, we're all in it together. These guys, whether it's the white supremacists in this country, which are on the rise, and in Europe, or whether it's the ones that claim to represent Islam and have kind of almost hijacked the religion, or the Buddhist extremists in Myanmar or whatever, what they're doing is, as core part of their ideology, they are elevating one identity over everything else. Right, so they want, when they talk, let's say, I'm a Muslim, they would want for me to think of myself only as a Muslim, not as an Iranian, not as a British person, not as somebody who's been married to an Italian for 20 years. All these multiple identities that we carry with us, which to me is the essence of pluralism and how we actually connect and relate to each other. These groups are trying to shred us apart and say, you know, your whiteness matters or your religion matters, and that elevates you above everybody else. And it's really dangerous because we're living in the age of extreme pluralism also. We've never ever had societies where so many of us have been together closely and as I say, mixed marriages and mixed race and so forth. And so they're trying to pull this apart. And at the core of all of their ideologies is misogyny. This is such a central piece of it. They want to co-opt and coerce women. They want women to be, you know, not in the public sphere with a voice and shaping things. They're happy to recruit women, and they tap into women's desire and aspirations and women wanting to have agency, but to be subservient to their cause, right? And they've done a very, very good job of it, I'm afraid to tell you. Because while we on the Western or whatever side have been saying, yes, we must empower women, they've actually gone in and said, we get it. Nobody's listening to you. You want a better life. You want a better, you know, you think things aren't just, come work with us. We'll give you this and that and the other. And if you talk to women who've been in the Boko Haram movement, for some of them, life in Boko Haram was much better than life in their community in Nigeria, right? So it's really this issue of tapping into agency on their side is important, but the other side, and I'll just finish here, is that because they have targeted women from the beginning, and they've been doing it for 30 years, it doesn't matter which of these movements you talk about, it is also women who on the ground have been at the forefront of fighting them. They have the best solutions, they have the most innovative strategies. I call them, I say that my partners, we have partners in 30 countries, are strategically pragmatic. And just think, as women, we are always pragmatic, and we're always strategic. You know, people think that it's idealistic. No, it's very realistic, very grounded work, and it's extraordinary to see some of the ways that they're navigating these spaces. But from an international security standpoint, they're invisible, they're excluded. When they do something, they're taken for granted. And so my work has been to elevate and amplify and bring those voices to the international spaces and say they actually have the answers. Listen to them. Listen to these people. They know what's going on, and take their guidance. And that is one of the biggest challenges in the 22 years I've been doing this work.
Great way to help us shape and understand how long this has really been going on. Really important. Palwasha, bring us into a situation that you know and you've worked with in Afghanistan.
Yeah. So, Sanam, thank you so much for setting this up very nicely in terms of how...
I think you'll have to be closer to your mic, too.
All right, thank you for setting this up, Sanam, so nicely. One thing I think it would be helpful to clarify is maybe a little bit more about what we mean by violent extremism. And oftentimes, we talk about extremism, radicalization, or radicals without thinking of the whole picture. You know, some people can be conservative and fundamental in their beliefs, but don't turn to violence. Some people can have very extremist perspectives, but are tolerant of other people. And we're not talking about those. We're talking about those the people that take up arms, that kill one another because of their beliefs or their system, their understanding, and the extremism that they come from. I was actually, like I said, in 1989, I was in Peshawar on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. This was in the early 90s when the international jihadi movement was starting to spread and what turned into Al-Qaeda and then eventually ISIS. So I had this firsthand experience of how it was affecting communities and what was happening there. I was living in a place where actually the wives of these international jihadi fighters were living. And I got to see firsthand how it was affecting these women, where they did not have any income. They were basically bartering with each other to survive in that circumstance, where one of the fighters would die and they would be forced to marry another fighter. And this was all happening around me without me recognizing a lot of what was going on until much later in my life. But what kind of effect did this have on women at that time, and what does it continue to have effect on? At that time, and what it continued to do, is that when women were going to work And as they now are going to work in different regions of Afghanistan and Pakistan, when women were going to school, there were attacks against them. There were night letters against them. People had things stapled to their door that told them they couldn't go out, otherwise they would be targeted. And this continues to happen. And this is something that we continue to see, where very conservative groups in Afghanistan and Pakistan continue to thrive and exist. They continue to target women in this way. So as the US troops pulled out of Afghanistan, and the international troops all of ISAF pulled out of Afghanistan, it created a lot of these vacuums where women had been going to school, women had been going to work, but in the provinces where there wasn't security anymore, the rise of extremism sort of filled that vacuum. You had the Taliban or shadow governments of the Taliban take over, and women could no longer do the things that they had been doing for up until that point, 5, 6, 7 years. So you have women who are not able to go to work regularly, women who are not able to join to places like the police, like even just maintain security. They weren't able to go to their jobs. They weren't, and they continue to have this problem, not being able to go to schools and not being able to go to their places of work. But what has changed and shifted is that women are now being targeted. So before, women in hospitals, you didn't see as much targeting. Now you're seeing more targeting of women who are working in hospitals, women who are vaccinators going to door, and some of them may be fully covered, you know, wearing a niqab, completely covering their faces, and yet they still have been attacked and kidnapped by the Taliban and extremist groups in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and also lady health workers. And so this has really created smaller and smaller spaces, so limited mobility for women, both to work and to go to school and get an education. The third thing I wanted to talk about was elections. Now in Afghanistan, there's going to be upcoming elections this year, hopefully October, although we're not sure. But the increasing spaces of these extremist groups in Afghanistan, and now we're having ISIS also in Afghanistan, along with groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir and Taliban, means that fewer women are actually running for office. We have fewer women running for office than we've had in the past, since the first elections in 2004. We have a huge fear of women turning out to vote. So not only is it affecting women who are running, but also there is consideration for how it's going to be affecting women who will be voting. And part of this is not just coming from, hearsay. It's actually that women parliamentarians have been attacked, they have been kidnapped, and their children and their families have been attacked and kidnapped as well. So there is this fear that comes from this experience of current members, not only parliamentarians from the National Assembly, but also provincial assemblies have been attacked in Afghanistan. Sanam mentioned the issue of misogyny being very central to violent extremism. We have been working on something called everyday peace indicators in Afghanistan. And this comes from people in the community saying, these are things that we notice as indicators that say that violence is going to happen in their community. And these are indicators of things that are where we say, okay, things have calmed down and we think that our community is now moving towards peace. And one of the everyday peace indicators towards violence is actually domestic violence against women. And this is something that we're hoping to study more, because it's not just in Afghanistan, we're seeing this overall around the world, that this is an indicator that communities have been saying. We haven't been able to find a direct correlation overall, but this is what, coming from the community, what women have been saying, that there seems to be a rise in domestic violence in the community when violent extremism and conflict is rising in their community. I just wanted to mention 2 more points, and that is that on the flip side of things, ISIS has been targeting women in Afghanistan and has been working to bring them in for recruiting, for funding, accounting, doing propaganda and whatnot. And so it's not just that women are on the side of being victims, but they also, we've been noticing, have been recruited and are on the side of perpetrators of violent extremism. And this is something we need to take into account as we're developing ways of combating violent extremism and overcoming violent extremism in these communities. Another issue that's come up, and it's something I think that isn't talked about as much, but is also women that are promoting the obligation of men, particularly from the Shia community, to join the Fatimiyun and learn how to fight with Assad regime in Syria. And this has been a rising concern and a concern of polarization in Afghanistan as well. So you have ISIS and those that are fighting ISIS in Syria, but they're actually recruiting in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan and Pakistan sort of being that hub of where the whole international, we call it the international jihadi movement, but also the international movement to start this terrorism, these concepts of terrorism that have really started. So I'll end here.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that full spectrum of how all of this is interconnected. Oge, tell us about what's happening in Nigeria to begin with, maybe.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Sanam and Palwasha. As I mentioned earlier, I don't have a background in preventing violent extremism. So I'm talking about these issues more from a governance background, because that's the way I approach these issues. And I want to basically tee the conversation up with an example or an experience. When I spoke about growing up in Nigeria, and I think one of the experiences that really touched me when the conflict had broken out in Plateau State was when my mother and my now would-be mother-in-law got missing for about an entire week. So the both of them had gone out to a community because they work, they both, as I mentioned, both my parents are missionaries, and they had gone out to a community and they were working in a community and the conflict had broken out. And so when it broke out, no one had heard from them for about a week, until the conflict was ongoing. After a couple of days, it was okay for the security to go into this community to search for survivors or to search for those who they hadn't heard from. And my mom and mother-in-law were taken by a community member and protected in this woman's house. And they were there for an entire week. They had changed their clothes, everything, and stayed there. She kept them safe for an entire week. And at that point, that really taught me something. Like, it taught me a very important lesson, that when push comes to shove, women are always there looking out for each other. They didn't care that they were Christian women or Muslim women. That wasn't what the issue was. They were there looking out for each other. And I think with the work that we do in Nigeria, this comes out more and more. Every single time I engage with the women at the community level, or I engage with the partners that we work with, the importance of forming those networks at the community level, the importance of having conversations, the importance of recognizing the things that bind us beyond our background, our nationality, our religion. And I see this increasingly with women, always being able to come together to look out for each other. And so I think for me, last week, I just got off a plane this week from Nigeria. And last week we were in Yola in northeast Nigeria. Yola is one of the, Yola is in Adamawa state, and it's one of the states that has been hit by the Boko Haram insurgency. So there are 3 states over there: Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe state. And we were in Yola, and I met the most amazing, amazing woman. This is a young woman who is a huntress, basically, in her community, a local hunter. She's a titled woman in her community. And when Boko Haram became an issue in her village, she basically picked up her gun, organized a couple of other women in the village, and they would go out at night to hunt Boko Haram. Wow. It was the most amazing thing ever. Very humble woman, but as soon as this happened in her community, they picked up their weapons and said, we are going to go fight this. And they didn't care that people came from different backgrounds or all these women just came together to fight this issue in their community. And I think that's tying it back to the governance issue of really trying to see how women are incorporated in some of the strategies that government has put in place to address violent extremism. Increasingly, we continue seeing that it's a gap. As Sanam and Palwasha have mentioned, extremist groups have found a way to incorporate women in the stories that they tell, either using them for recruitment, using them, unfortunately, in the case of Boko Haram, as suicide bombers, because and unfortunately, the governments in some of these countries where we working in many of the countries we work in, haven't found a way to effectively incorporate women. They always talk about gender mainstreaming, which is, I have a problem with that. When you try to mainstream gender across every issue, across everything you're trying to do, it leads to a lack of focus. And I think that is one question, and probably something that we need to look more at as we talk about violent extremism. Look at the governance angle as well. And as we talk about the strategies that governments are putting in place to address these issues, how are women really incorporated? How are the voices of women incorporated? How are the experiences of women incorporated? There's strategies, the strategies that are being implemented around security, do those take into account the views of women? And not only women at the capital level or the women at the international level. I'm talking about your everyday women at the community level, at the grassroots level, because in the case of Nigeria, we've actually realized that that is really where the power lies. When these women come together, they can move mountains when they come together. And like the Bring Back Our Girls campaign, well, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Bring Back Our Girls campaign here. And like, while that campaign started with voices at, to some extent, the capital level, the base that is actually moving that, pushing that movement forward are the voices of women at the community level, at the state level, being able to connect those experiences to our national policy, to national policies or ideas that we push at the international level is extremely important. And to some extent, our work in Nigeria really tries to connect those voices. We try to connect the voices from the state level to the national level, because the woman who is in the community is concerned that her son or her neighbor's son is being recruited into a violent extremist group. She couldn't really care less about what the fancy policy is in the policy book. All she knows is that my child is being recruited into this violent extremist group. What can I do to stop this? And I think if we're able to bring ourselves down to some extent when we engage with policymakers, and it's wonderful engaging in the fancy offices and all that stuff, but when you engage with policymakers, be able to bring yourself down to the level of those who really feel the brunt of the issues. And it reminds me of that woman in that local community that took my mother and my mother-in-law in when push came to shove, when the entire village was going up in flames. She didn't know about whatever resolution it was there in the capital city. All she knew was, these women are my sisters, and I need to look out for them. So in a nutshell, that's what we see with our work in Nigeria.
Yeah, thanks, Oge. That's very powerful images and stories to help us get inside that community level. You know, one of the issues that actually is facing not only parts of the Middle East and Africa, but certainly Europe and the States is, what happens when somebody decides to leave one of these groups? And what happens to the community back home? Are they accepted? What is that process like? Sanam, do you want to set us up here?
Sure, thank you. This is the issue that is, I think, keeping a lot of people awake at night across the world. ICANN just hosted a meeting on the challenges of reintegrating and rehabilitating women and girls associated with with these extremist groups. And we looked at it both from the ones that leave a country and go off, you know, so you go from, I don't know, France and go to Syria and you want to come back, or the ones that were crossing borders between, say, Kenya and Somalia, going into Somalia and coming back, so it's sort of closer. But also the ones, places like Pakistan, where the extremism is seeded and it's sprouting within the communities themselves, and everybody's integrated in this. So how do you de-radicalize in place, in a sense? And I'll just give you a few examples of what for me was interesting. Number one, we have, when you look at the Western countries, you know, European countries, the US, Canada, and so forth, of course there are people who went to ISIS and Al-Shabaab and so forth, and we're trying to figure out how to come back. The numbers are not that high, right? We're, you know, maybe 100, maybe 200, and our governments are killing themselves trying to figure out what to do. In the UK, they were talking about 850 that went. They're not sure how many are coming back. But there is a lot of resistance about, you know, well, you know, the policymakers in England said, we should kill them all in Syria. Well, how do you do that? Let's say that's what you wanted to do. But what does that mean? Who are you going to bomb to try and get one guy because they're integrated in the community? So it's not realistic. Second is they say, oh, you know, okay, well, they should all come back and go to prison. Well, prisons, under any government has control over. Prisons are the first place where radicalization is actually happening. So it's like, get your source sorted out there before you, right? And then the third problem which arises in all of this is that we have a lot of people who may have been coerced into going. They may have been trafficked, you know, told you're going off, and actually they were forced. They may have gone by choice. A lot of the European women and girls who went were girls. They were under the age of 18. They were being sexually groomed online and radicalized. So you know, they went, you know, yes, and what the problem is that, or Boko Haram, you know, they kidnap a lot of kids. Like the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, they force them to do horrific things so that they break their contact with their families and their communities. So now you have people who are victims and perpetrators, right? And so what do you do with that? It's a complicated set of issues, and we need to think about sort of think about them as individuals and process them in a sense from that perspective. What we found, which for me was very interesting, is that countries like Indonesia and Nigeria and others actually have better policies and at least some thinking and conceptual framing and things like services in place around how you deal with them. Because one of the challenges we have is that if I decide that I want to work with these people that are returning, if they're deemed to be terrorists, then I'm aiding and abetting terrorists, right? So then I get into trouble. So I mean, literally, you know, most countries don't even have laws around. So it's a lot of hidden work that has to be done. We have a partner in Kenya that started looking at this problem and discovered that there were many hundreds of young women and girls who had been kind of going between the borders of Kenya and Somalia and coming back. And the intelligence services hadn't even thought about this, right? Because who cares about women and girls? It's literally, I mean, and that's the essence of all of this. They don't care. Our governments, whatever they say, if you have a policy that you haven't put into practice and if people don't feel it on the ground, it means you really don't care. And when you don't care and you leave a vacuum, somebody else comes and offers something different. And that's really been the cycle that we're in. And I'll just give you a couple of interesting stories. We had one of our partners in Pakistan last year. We funded them. They identify these women. They're very deeply rooted in their communities, and then they do a program of they've talked to the men to say what's appropriate, you know, and they bring them into their program through economic livelihood initiatives. You know, come and you can earn a living, which is culturally appropriate and so forth. But through that process, they also are teaching them religious literacy and cultural literacy around what their culture is, and then they form volunteer groups that go back into the communities to spread the message of coexistence and nonviolence. Last year, one of these groups discovered a group of women who had a little sewing circle, and they were sewing suicide jackets, and they're selling them, right? Because you make money. So they brought them in, and through this process of training and so forth, managed to. Some of them became, you know, decided, you know, it was like they could. Some of them were trained to make samosas at home and sell them. You know, they have to work from home, so some started doing that. Others have started doing fabric dyeing. Others are doing embroidery, but alternative income, which is more than what they were getting from what they were sewing before. but also this other mentality, which then they spread it at home with their kids, with their sons, and so forth. But because they're earning an income, it gives them a bit more power at home as well. So this is the kind of thing that our partners are doing. And I asked her, and we, the way the funding system works is that, we rerun and we try and get money from a government, and they'll give it and they'll say, it's got to be done by, March of whatever this year. So you have 12-month periods. So we were able to do this for 4 or 5 months, and their work has continued because it's changing mindsets, right? Once you change mindsets, people don't go back, right? And they work with them, they continue to work with them. But I asked her, how much does it cost to do this? And it comes to about $1,000 a year per woman, right? To just bring them in, have the centers, continue the work, enable them to work with it. We're talking such little money. What bothers me the most is that here we have trillions of dollars being spent in Afghanistan or Iraq, and it's not being done right? $10,000 in the hands of the right person at the right time, who cares, goes an awful long way compared to the trillions that we see. Our partner in Nigeria did a 15-week radio show. She brought Islamic scholars to local radio in local language to talk about what Islam says about violence, coexistence, peace building, education. They had a 40% increase in school enrollment just from that. And now the demand for schools. And the problem is, going to the governance side of the story, that the Nigerian government is not showing up to build the schools or to provide the services, right? So these are some of the challenges that we're seeing. But when you care, you do stuff. And it comes back to, when we're called ICANN, I'm like, we couldn't call ourselves Wiccan because Wiccan is a coven of witches, so we didn't want to be a bunch of witches. Some people may think we are, I don't know. But the idea of ICANN is so central to the work that we do, because honestly, if you met my partners, you would feel like I do. It's like, how on earth does she get up in the morning and continue to do this work? Because she's also quite alone. This is really dangerous work. And they do it because they care. And so we connect them. We have a whole network, and we talk to each other on WhatsApp just to say, hey, hi, how are you? I'm here. Yesterday there was an attack in Somalia. A health worker was killed. Are you guys okay? There was 17 women were killed in Libya 2 days ago. We don't even hear this in the news, right? We're worried about Stormy Daniels. This is the real news out there, folks. And you need to find it, and we need to change the discourse in this country, because honestly, at 9/11, there were 5,000 violent extremists. 17 years of American warfare out there, we have hundreds and thousands. And if we think that ISIS is done, trust me, MISIS, an iteration of it is coming out, because we also are so much a part of the problem. I can't say that enough. We, as the Western countries and as the military forces that are selling the weapons and so forth, are as extreme in our violence and in our ideology as those groups are. And we have to understand that and own that as part, and I recognize we're part of the problem as well.
Thank you, Sanam, for setting that in motion of really what is this reintegration and all the various ways people become radicalized. I'm watching my clock carefully because I do want to make sure we have time, but Palwasha, can you talk about a little bit of your work with women as interlocutors between the imams and the local communities, both sides of the story?
Yeah, thank you. So some of the research that I've been doing right now has been looking at what kind of roles are women playing at the local level in bringing about peace in their communities. And actually, when I was in Afghanistan, I came across a number of anecdotal stories, actually talking to women in different workshops, hearing about some of the work that they had been doing, but that wasn't really captured. This actually started when development councils were being formed in the early 2000s, and the community development councils that were being formed at the village level, they were actually giving opportunities for women to be part of the decision-making bodies at that local level. So women were being elected to these village councils, women were being elected to the top tier, particularly widows were taking on more and more responsibility of leadership in their communities. And this was a tradition in Afghanistan that had pre-existed, but during the time of the war, it sort of broke up that tradition of women's involvement, and this really conservative force that had come through had changed the perspective, and sort of people's memories were lost about the role women had played. And so with this opening of village councils, women are starting to take more and more leadership that they had been taking in the past. And so I heard these stories of women going to Taliban groups and negotiating with them on different issues. And particularly after ISAF and the coalition forces left Afghanistan, they were negotiating on things which I found were fascinating, to keeping girls' schools open. There were a few women who came from the eastern Pashtun belt in Paktia who were saying, oh yeah, we had trouble, Taliban came when this vacuum happened, and they wanted to shut down our girls' school. And we negotiated with them. We sat down and we said, well, why do you want to shut down the school? They said, well, the curriculum is not Islamic. They said, okay, let's sit down and review the curriculum. What do you mean it's not Islamic? So they went through and they said, okay, let's add a subject particular to Islamic studies. Okay, we'll add another subject on Islamic studies. We want to make sure there are no men in the buildings of the school. Okay, fine. There will be no men. Have guards outside. No men allowed. There are no men in it. We want to make sure that there's a prayer space for girls in the school. Okay, sure. There'll be a prayer space for girls in the school. And through this negotiation, they were able to keep their girls' school open. This was very fascinating to me. And I tried to look for more and more of these stories. And what I was finding was there were women who were doing this at the local level. Nobody was capturing it. Even the village elders didn't really recognize what was happening. But there was a checkpost. The Taliban were in an area where their checkpost was on lands that the community cultivated. And the people in that community couldn't go from the village, couldn't go to their land because they were afraid they would be shot at from this Taliban checkpost. So the elders in the community went to one of the women who was one of the village leaders who had been doing work with these councils and also had been doing some other had been doing sewing, actually. Actually, I'm wearing one of the scarves from the group Kandahar Treasure that works with women to empower them through the embroidery that they do and selling these things abroad. So she was actually from this sewing circle and recognized in her community. And they said, well, would you go and talk to these Taliban and ask them to move their checkpoint? And so this woman gathered 5 other women who were elderly, had white hair, and went to this Taliban checkpost and talked to them and said, oh, our sons, why are you staying here? This is not the best place and people need to cultivate their land. They're like, well, this is the best strategic point for us to actually guard this area. And then they started talking to them about, well, religiously, it's not good for you to prevent people from accessing their food and their income, and you're preventing them, and you're preventing women and children from actually having food and having nutrition by your presence being here. And they went through this, both giving, talking to them as if you're our sons, you shouldn't be doing this, talking to sort of shaming them, oh, as a good Pashtun boy, you shouldn't be doing this and preventing, and then also talking to them from a religious perspective. And through this, they were able to convince this group to move their checkpost away. Now, we have lots of these stories. Nobody's documenting it, but women are doing amazing things, very courageous things at the local level, really crossing boundaries. They're able to cross those boundaries. They're able to talk in non-threatening ways in very scary places to make change happen and bring peace in their local communities and engaging with some of these very, very violent extremists.
Wonderful example. I'm going to come back to Oge. So can you give us an example of some good government policies that you think might have some sort of hope for the prevention of violent extremism? And in lieu of that, I'll give you a backdoor, some local strategies that you think are working.
It's always a problem when you have to struggle to think about good government policies. Well, in the case of Nigeria, I would specifically identify some of the things that we see happening at the state level, not necessarily the national level. And I think it's also, as we understand Nigeria and we understand the way Nigeria works, so it's a country with 36 states. And at the state level, people feel closer to the state government and even closer to the local government. So I think there's a growing realization about this. Just a brief history or background on Nigeria. There was a transition in 1999 from decades of military regimes, back and forth military regimes, and then in 1999 there was that transition to civilian rule. So I think it's been a process of trial and error since then, and a process of learning a process of learning since 1999. So what we've seen, at least at the state level, is that some state governments are beginning to understand that they have to be able to take actions at that local level, at the state level, to curb violence before it becomes, to curb conflict before it becomes violent. In the case of Boko Haram, when Boko Haram started, it started in a small community in northeast Nigeria. And when you had a fragile or an ineffective state government that was unable to contain it or unable to negotiate or have effective dialogue with individuals in the community, it blew out of proportion and turned into the monster that we see today. So there are a lot of state governments that are beginning to understand that they have to take several initiatives to try to address violence at the local level before it blows out of proportion. One of them that we've seen in Plateau and in Kuehnast states, these are two states in the Middle Belt. You know, apart from Boko Haram in northeast Nigeria, there are also concerns about farmer-herder conflicts too as well. I don't know if you all are familiar with these farmer-herder conflicts, where it's typically, in the past, these were low-level conflicts that happened between different communities where pastoralists had to take their cattle across different farms, and unfortunately they end up destroying the crops, and then the farmers, it turns into conflict between the farmers. But then there were traditional systems in place that were able to resolve these conflicts. Over time, these traditional systems have eroded, so there are huge gaps over there, and these conflicts that were once low-level conflicts have now turned violent and are taking on different dimensions where, unfortunately, religion is being thrown into it, because a lot of the pastoralists are Muslims, the majority of the farmers are Christians, so it becomes, it has now taken on a new dimension as a religious conflict. There's also criminality involved, where you have cattle rustling and cattle raids and people coming in and stealing people's cattle. So it's taken on a life of its own. And at the state level, we've seen state governments trying to set up these sort of state peace-building institutions. Institutions that are able to understand, engage with the people, understand what their issues are, and work with them to come together to find solutions, to find avenues to address the problems. And rather than addressing the effects of the conflict, trying to take several steps back to address the root causes of this conflict. Sometimes we find that, at least in the case of Nigeria and the conversations that we've been having at the state level, sometimes we find that we're very reactive when it comes to addressing conflict. We react when Boko Haram sets off a bomb. We react when, hundreds of people are killed. We react, but we never take a step back to really understand why. And I find that in our conversations and discussions with governments, that's really one of the most difficult questions. It gets them scratching their heads when you begin to ask, why? Why did this happen in the first place? If only we could take some time to really understand why some things happen, or why some conflicts turn violent and some others do not turn violent, I think we'll be one step closer to finding real sustainable solutions. I also want to mention, so USIP, through our Applied Conflict Transformation Center here, there's also a program a project that we have called the Justice Security Dialogues Initiative. and it's run across the Sahel. But in Plateau State in particular, in one community in Jos North local government area, where there's been a lot of tension and conflict between the police and the young men in the community, that the conflict got to a point where the young men basically burnt down the police station in this community. And so through a dialogue process, an 18-month dialogue process, it brought the security actors and the young men together after 18 months. And just last week, when we were in Nigeria last week, we actually witnessed them coming together and starting to rebuild the police station together. Mm-hmm. So there are initiatives like this that work at the local level. And we're beginning to realize that some of this is just people talking to each other. We set up so many artificial barriers, and I think I love the point that Sanam made about, you know, when we try to extremism, those who push extremist ideology try to restrict our other identities, the other things that make us who we are, and try to elevate just one thing about ourselves. And through that, the 18-month dialogue that these young men and the security actors undertook in this community, they began to realize that there was so much that they had in common. Oh, that the policeman with someone from the community were both from the same village, and they basically knew the same person. So I'm like, very basic, simple stories like that bring people together. And it was wonderful for us to actually be there to witness them, you know, coming together, two traditional chiefs who hadn't sat down together for almost 20 years were actually sitting down together for the first time to witness the rebuilding of the police station. So there are local approaches like this that work. There are strategies like this that work. And I love the point that you made about these things really being inexpensive. It doesn't cost a lot of money. It really doesn't cost a lot of money. Bringing communities together to have constructive conversation doesn't really take much. All it really takes, we have to see the political will. And sometimes that's where the gap is.
Yeah, it takes time. And that's what we have to have more of to make a difference. Well, thank you all. And I really want to come back to all of you. And we have time, and I'm going to hear as many questions as possible and then turn it back to the panel. So we have a mic so that everybody can hear, and if you would just raise your hand if you want to make a comment or ask a question. Okay, we have one here. Do we have raise your hands, please, folks. There's one. Next. I wanted let...
I think everybody can
No,
hear me.
please use the microphone, if you wouldn't mind using the microphone, because we're actually taping the session. Oh. Thank you so much. Would you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Eileen Abbey. I come from the Hudson chapter in Ohio. I'd like to ask questions for our first panelist. You said something about Indonesia had a better setup. Do you think that's because Indonesia is about 80% Muslim?
Okay. Next question. I'm going to get the questions and then we'll get the answers. Right over here, please. Yeah, go ahead and stand up so they can identify you. And thank you so much. Introduce yourself.
Oh.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Laurie Stroop, and I'm a chapter coordinator in Baltimore. And my question is related to any of the three women, and thank you so much for all of your remarks. They've been excellent. Has the whole idea of bringing community together on whatever level it might be, being such an important part of all of the sort of facilitation of efforts, has social media and technology played a role in the countries that you have been talking about to make any change? Or is it detrimental, or is it a hindrance in some way, shape, or form?
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Another question. We have two right here, right in the middle. If you want to, Chris, if you want to bring it around, and then we'll, yeah, thanks. All right.
Hi there. Hi there. I'm Laura Burnett, and I'm from the West. I'm a mentor in Southern California.
Great.
So my question is very similar to the last question, and what I'm wondering about is education. And I'm assuming, since men and boys go to school, are they being taught how to, you know, I mean, why do we always go to violence? Can we talk? Can we teach them to talk? And is that part of the solution?
Yes, the unlearning of violence.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Donna Rayburn from Charleston, South Carolina. We haven't talked about the aftermath with these young and old women who have experienced extreme violence. What are the symptoms, and are they treated locally by fellow women, or do they need professionals? I don't know how so many areas could afford professionals, but what can you do to help women?
Great question. Somebody right up there in the middle. Thanks, Chris. I think you have it.
Hi, my name is Laurel Seidelman, and I'm from Chicago, Illinois. And my question is this: first of all, I'm very proud of the good work that Dining for Women does, because I think in every aspect you've spoken about, I think we can think of an organization that we have supported working on the grassroots level with people in the community.
Absolutely.
But my question for you is, what are you doing in terms of educating the U.S. public about the work of the Institute of Peace? I have to be truthful, I never heard of you before. And I think, you know, as we look at our tax dollars and how significant an issue that is to most taxpayers, should we not be looking at other alternatives for not sending military in immediately, but funding some of these other things that make so much more sense?
Yeah, thank you so much. One more question? Does anyone else? Right here in the front. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the comments and questions coming from you all.
Hi, my name is Judy. I'm from the San Jose, one of the San Jose, California chapters. And I wanted to ask if each of you could sum up 3 important points that you would, actions that you would like government or individuals to take to further the process of peace in communities around the world.
Well, and that will take another hour, but I agree. Those are great questions. All right, I'm going to close out the Q&A here, and I'm going to turn it over. Okay, I'm going to begin with you, and you don't obviously have to answer all of these questions. If you could just pick a couple that resonate, and any final comments, including, I'll move it to one important action, because these will be our kind of final remarks. So over to you, Oge, and then Palwasha and Sanam will end with you.
Okay. So the first question I'll take is a question on social media. And yes, in Nigeria, we're seeing a huge upsurge of social media, but there's also a generational gap too as well. So younger people get their information from social media. WhatsApp is really big in Nigeria. Everyone is on WhatsApp. And then some of the older still get their information from the traditional news media and the newspapers. Yes, it is a growing concern that sometimes there might be some language on social media or on some social media platforms that can inspire hate, that some may have also categorized as hate speech or dangerous speech. And this is something that is a lot of folks are really paying attention to, especially in the case of Nigeria, as the country will be having elections, national elections, early next year. So yes, social media is really big, and it does play a huge role in how people get their information, even at the grassroots level, because smartphones are also very accessible in Nigeria. They're not as expensive, especially with a lot of the Chinese phones as well that they have in Nigeria, so it's not as expensive, and many people are able to use them. with education on the question on unlearning violence, I think one of the things that we've seen in Nigeria, and this might be the case in Afghanistan as well, and in other places where you have some of these violent extremist groups, is that when they emerge, they typically go after educational institutions. And in the case of Nigeria, one of the recent studies or surveys that we've seen is that probably about 2,000 teachers have died, have been killed by Boko Haram since it became a phenomenon. Schools are often destroyed, just things that would intimidate individuals and intimidate communities from sending their children to school. And not only women alone, for instance, the Chibok girls that were kidnapped from their schools. We also have the incident that just happened in February of this year, where young women were taken away from their hostels. But young men as well have also been killed. Young men have been killed just for going to school as well. So it doesn't only affect women when it comes to education, it also affects young men as well. So the question about what happens to women when they come back to their communities, I think one of the things that we didn't address here was the question about stigma and what a lot of these women face when they come back. In the case of Boko Haram, in the case of Nigeria, you have so many young women who were taken, and some of them are coming back now with babies. So that's becoming an issue, and I think one that the government is also trying to find ways to tackle, because it's kind of new, it's new for them. But then there are different community actors and different organizations as well that are providing some type of help and assistance to the women. And my other colleagues may talk more about this since they follow the issues closely.
Last comments.
So the last comment on
important action.
Important action. One important action, or if I could give two important actions. The first, listen. We should always listen. And second, strengthen voices. Do not plan to replace the voices, but strengthen voices.
Great. Thank you so much, Ovi. Palwasha.
That's going to be hard to follow. So on the social media question, I wanted to add the point that in Afghanistan, we're seeing that social media spaces are opening up, particularly for young women, where they're able to voice their concerns more openly, and they're able to interact in a community more openly. Like, they might not use their own picture, they might not use their own name, but they're able to interact and have a presence. And so we're seeing that kind of empowerment of political voices sort of open up. Now, a few years ago, we had a panel on social media in Afghanistan and how it's relating to violent extremism, and this is one of the issues that came up in terms of women being able to raise their voices. Just last year when I was in Afghanistan, the women of my generation were saying, wow, the younger women, they're so active on social media and they don't mind posting their pictures, and we were so scared of posting our pictures because of what people would say against us and the violent extremists and all that, but they're out there and they're doing it, and they have so much courage in doing it. So I think social media is really opening up a lot of spaces, particularly for young women in Afghanistan. And like you were saying, accessibility there's a lot more accessibility, and even in provinces where it's harder to reach by road and whatnot, they do have mobile phones and smartphones, and they're able to have accessibility to social media. In terms of education and teaching men, this is something that we've been working on. Actually, I think there's a panel particularly on this.
So at lunch, make sure you hear about that panel.
Yeah, and there's a wonderful video about USIP's work and working with young male youth on masculinity issues. But just to mention that USIP has done some really amazing programs in bringing together youth who come from very traditional backgrounds, from the traditional madrasas that are being taught really conservative ideology, and bringing those coming from secular schools to work together on journalism. And this project, we saw amazing ways that they opened up. They understood how language can be very polarizing and what kind of language they can use that's more neutral, and how important it is to value each other's opinions and really open up in terms of building tolerance in that space. So there are areas like small projects that we've been doing like that open up those kinds that are really targeting young men and boys. We also have done a number of religious peace education projects where we go to, well, right now we have a Buddhist peace education project in Burma, Myanmar, where we're working with the monks there to develop a curriculum on peace education in the monasteries there. So they're, instead of teaching violent extremism, they'll be teaching, they're working on teaching more peaceful Buddhist principles and the way of the Buddha that is more peaceful. So those are some examples that are really targeting young men and boys, but of course it's a huge topic that we can talk a lot about. In terms of the aftermath, I just want to mention mental health care is really important in Afghanistan. They're trying to incorporate into basic package of health services. It's an area that's much needed. The thinking is over 75 to 80% of women across the country have mental health issues and they're not being dealt with because of the violence in Afghanistan and their experience of the violence. So that's a big gap the government is trying to work in, but still struggling. So in terms of further actions,
One action.
Yes. Action. Wow. Okay, I think you said it in terms of listen. I really agree to that. Listen and raising other people's voices, particularly women's voices. But I think what you're doing now in terms of gathering more information and knowledge about the situations that you don't hear most about and expressing those to the communities that you're in so that people understand. A lot of times it's through these personal interactions that we can open up each other's worldview and through our personal relationships with each other that we're able to do that. So I really appreciate that you're here and that you're listening and that you're taking this knowledge back to your communities about some of these issues that we don't hear about in the media and the news and different perspectives.
Thanks, Palwasha. Sanam, wrap us up.
Yes, Indonesia, and whether it's because it's majority Muslim, you hit the nail on the head. Essentially, the way I see it is that when we have these fighters coming back, if they're Muslim or from different ethnic backgrounds coming into Western Europe, they're basically not seen as citizens. I mean, they're certainly not seen as of us. They're not seen, whereas they are of us. They were born in England or France or Canada. And coming to the question of what's happening with the women and girls, a lot of the women and girls are not returning for simple reasons like they've had babies there. And if you're a Canadian citizen and now you've had a baby in Syria, is the Canadian government or the American government or whoever it is, are they going to give a passport to that baby? And if they're not, then what are we doing with these children that are undocumented around the world?
Or stateless.
And they are stateless. And guess who's going to take them? And guess what's going to happen in the next 10 to 15 years? This is a huge ticking something. And we really, this is serious, right? And these children are innocent, obviously, but this is what we're doing to them. Statelessness is now a big, big problem. In terms of social media, same thing. We have a lot of our partners engage in social media. I mean, we certainly, in my network, every day we're using WhatsApp and so forth as a way of just connecting, but also on the ground in Pakistan and elsewhere they're using it. But also local radio is important because in some of these places there is no social media. So it's still local radio and TV and so that space. And one of the things that we need is we need help in how to bring positive alternative voices into that social media space. As nonprofits right now, we're now in a space where we're meant to become video producers and meme producers, and I'm a Luddite when it comes to this stuff, right? But it's also the financing that goes with it and the strategies of how do you elevate. But we know that if we could bring alternative voices that enable somebody who cares, who's radical because they care about what's happening in the world, but when they go online, they get directed to the dark side, to actually say there's a light side. There are positive things you can do. That's really that would be really something that we need, and I would look forward to anybody who's interested in helping with that. In terms of education, this is very close to my heart. If I had an alternative life where I had an ideal wife at home and an ideal husband at home who did all the stuff and all these things, I'd be writing a book right now, which is called Prepping for Life, because I think that we need to be teaching our children peace and nonviolent communications, resilience to deal with all sorts of shocks, equality and pluralism. Pluralism is such an important part of what our children need to be learning all over the world. And we have the experiences, but we're living in a state where governments are pulling us apart. And I can't tell you how sensitive this issue becomes when you say to in Europe, to the old colonial powers, you say to them, you may want to teach the history of World War I or your presence in the world and why you have various second-generation immigrants from the standpoint of what you did over there. You were over there for 300 years, now you got folks here. Deal with it, but bring out the best, bring out the art and culture and the good things and there's a resistance, but we need to look at education curricula. Psychosocial, yes, there's a huge demand and a huge lack of services. One of the things that we're doing this year with our partners is we have partners in Nigeria who actually have a center. They train therapists, lay folks who are working in communities to be able to provide some basic therapy. We're taking our Nigerian partners and bringing them to Lebanon to actually do some training for our Iraqi partners because there's such a huge demand. And then meanwhile, across our network, people are saying, hey, we need this as well. So we're trying to provide across the countries, and again, happy to get any help anybody's interested in. Educating US public, absolutely. This is such a huge piece of it. Please join the Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. That's where you can get a lot of the information and take it out. We need the public to know. We have a Women, Peace and Security Act in this country. Yes, sorry, I'm going so fast. So Kathleen can tell you, there's a group called the Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace and Security.
It's on the USIP website because USIP is the secretariat.
CSWG.
Yes.
It's a bit of a mouthful. But we've been working, and last year, under this administration, Congress passed the Women, Peace and Security Act. And so we have a law in this country that says you should be addressing these issues. And we should be using that law to talk to Congress about why we're supporting the war in Yemen and why we're about to not sign up onto the Iran deal again, which is going to open up a whole set of new problems in terms of potential for violence and so forth. So we need an army in the country to be making the calls and telling Congress to engage in these issues. Yeah, and so in terms of where we are, I would welcome your group in terms of partnership with those of us who are working internationally because we do need that collaboration. And in the meantime, I would say to you, make yourselves be a pest, whether it's to your policymakers or to the media. Because every time you turn on CNN or NBC, if you still do, I don't anymore, it's a bunch of guys saying the same old nonsense, right? We need new voices, and we exist. And if you make the calls and make the demand, maybe they'll start thinking about things differently. And the big question to always ask when you hear these policymakers talking about stuff is, where are we going? What's it going to look like in 10 years' time? I mean, literally, none of them have. They all want to destroy stuff. They don't want to keep up. But none of them have where the hell are we going, folks? We are living in an age when none of us have seen this before. And what's coming at us is really, really dangerous. And it is at the community level that people are stopping it, but we need more voices and we need more on our side of the aisle, because I think majority of us don't want it, but extreme voices on all sides are now driving our future. Thank you.
Sanam and my fellow USIP colleagues, Palwasha and Oge, they've taken us from Iran to Afghanistan to Nigeria and back to Washington, D.C. in the United States. I think they've been amazing. Please sit at a table for lunch and tell the stories you heard. That's the biggest way we can spread the word. You are supposedly first out the doors for lunch. Straight out there, there's buffet. Get in line, enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you for the keynote at about noon with Abigail Disney. Thank you.